What kind of people would look up at something taller than a mountain, something older than the gods themselves, and decide to fight it anyway? To understand the answer, you have to understand what the Norse were truly afraid of. They called them the Jotnar, the giants. But these were not simple monsters hiding in the woods. They were forces. They were frost and stone, fire and flood, the living shape of chaos itself, and they were ancient long before the first god ever opened his eyes. Now picture the people who dared to stand against them. They lived in halls of timber and turf. They crossed freezing oceans in open wooden boats. They fought with axes, with shields, with hands that cracked in the cold. And yet somehow these fragile people looked at beings who could crush mountains and freeze the sea, and they told themselves a story in which their gods had won. But here is the question that should stop you cold. The question we will not fully answer until the very end. How could anyone that small ever truly believe they had defeated something that large? To feel why it mattered, step inside one of their longhouses on the blackest night of winter. The fire is dying. The wind outside doesn't howl so much as breathe, slow and enormous, as if something living is leaning against the walls. Out there, a single bad winter could erase an entire village. No crops, no cattle, no spring. To these people, the giants were not a metaphor. They were the thing pressing on the door. And to understand how the Vikings believed they had beaten them, we have to go back to the very beginning, to a time when the whole world was nothing but a corpse. In the beginning, there was no earth, no sea, no sky, only a vast and silent emptiness, the Norse called Ginnungagap, a yawning void waiting to be filled. To the north of that void lay a world of ice, brutal and endless. To the south lay a world of fire, roaring and alive. And for ages they simply existed, apart, until the freezing rivers of the ice crept slowly toward the heat of the flame. Where the two met, the ice began to melt, and in those first dripping streams of Thor, something impossible happened. Life appeared. Not a god, not a man, a giant. His name was Ymir, and he was so vast that he was less a creature than a landscape, a mountain of flesh breathing in the dark. As he slept, he sweated, and from that sweat new giants were born, crawling out of his body one after another, until an entire race existed, the frost giants, children of ice and heat and chaos. Ymir was their ancestor, and through him chaos itself had a face. Now, understand what these giants truly were to the Norse. They were not villains invented to frighten children. They were the storm that flattened the harvest. They were the winter that would not end. They were the mountain that split open and poured fire, the ground that shook and swallowed homes whole. And here is something the old stories rarely say out loud for a people who lived one failed harvest away from starvation. Turning that terror into giants was not weakness or superstition. It was survival of a different kind. You cannot fight a blizzard. You cannot bargain with the cold, but you can fight a giant. Give the darkness a name, a body, an enemy, and suddenly you have something to stand against, instead of something to simply die beneath. So the Norse gave chaos a shape, and they waited. But the giants would not rule the void forever, because three brothers were about to rise, and they carried something the universe had never seen before. Those three brothers were named Odin, Vili, and Ve, and their bloodline was a strange one, because they too were descended from the giants. But something in them had changed. Where the giants were chaos, these brothers carried order, the idea that the world could be shaped, structured, given law, instead of left to churn in the dark. And the very first thing this new order did was commit an act of staggering violence. They killed Ymir. Try to imagine that battle, the first war ever fought, not between men but between chaos and the will to end it. When Ymir finally fell, so much blood poured from his enormous body that it rose like a flood across the void, and nearly every giant alive drowned in it. Only a handful survived, scrambling to the far frozen edges of the world, where they nursed their grief into something colder, hatred. And they waited, in a distant realm that would come to be called Jotunheim. But the brothers were not finished, because a slain giant is still a mountain of raw material, and from Ymir's corpse they built everything you have ever known. His flesh became the earth beneath your feet, his blood became the seas and the lakes, his shattered bones became the mountains, his teeth the rocks and stones, and his vast skull was lifted up and stretched across the heavens to become the very dome of the sky. And here is the truth the Norse buried inside that image. A truth worth sitting with. Order was not built as the opposite of chaos. It was built out of chaos, from its body, using its bones. Every mountain a Viking ever looked up at was the skeleton of a giant. The enemy was never truly outside the world. The enemy was the world, and the gods knew it. They knew the survivors were out there, remembering, waiting. So whenever the giants grew too strong, the gods would need a champion, and his name would become a battle cry screamed across 1,000 frozen years. That name was Thor. If Odin was the mind of the gods, Thor was their shield, the wall of muscle and thunder standing between the fragile world of order and the giants who wanted it gone. He was the god of thunder, yes, but more than that, he was a protector, the guardian of both gods and humans, and in his hands he carried the answer to chaos itself, a hammer called Mjolnir, forged in fire by the master smiths of the dwarves. Mjolnir was not simply a weapon. When Thor hurled it, it flew straight and true, and always returned to his hand. It could level a fortress, it could split a mountain, it could call the lightning down out of a clear sky, and Thor used it, again and again, crossing into Jotunheim to meet the giants wherever they threatened the balance of the world. He smashed skulls, he shattered fortresses, he turned living giants into cautionary tales whispered in the dark. For a while, it seemed strength alone could hold chaos back. But the giants had learned something about Thor, something they could use, because not every battle is won with a hammer. Some are won with a lie. There is a story the Norse love to tell, of the day Thor travelled to the hall of a giant king called Utgarda Loki, and was invited to prove himself in a series of simple contests. First, he was handed a drinking horn and told to empty it in one draught. Thor drank until his chest ached, and the horn was barely lower than when he began. Then he was asked to lift a single grey cat from the floor, a child's task, and strain as he might, he could raise only one of its paws. Finally, humiliated, he was made to wrestle a withered old woman, and the mightiest warrior in all the cosmos was forced slowly to one knee. Thor left ashamed. But as he did, the giant king revealed the truth, and the truth was staggering. That horn had been secretly connected to the sea itself, and Thor had drunk so deeply he had lowered the tides of the ocean. That cat was no cat, it was the Midgard serpent, the monster that coils around the entire world, and he had lifted it until the sky trembled. And the old woman was old age itself, the one opponent no living thing has ever pinned. Thor had not failed at all. He had come within a breath of the impossible. And here is why the Norse treasured that story, because to them cunning sat as high as strength, and a mind that could be tricked could also learn. But there was one contest even Thor would never win, one opponent already marching toward him across the edge of time, and the gods knew it was coming. That opponent was the end of the world itself, a day the Norse called Ragnarok. The stories told it plainly, without comfort. One day, the giants would come all at once, the fire giants riding out of Muspelheim with blades of flame, the frost giants marching across seas frozen solid, and leading them would be Loki, who had once walked among the gods as a friend. Thor would meet the Midgard serpent one final time and finally kill the monster that coiled around the world, but he would stagger only 9 steps before its venom dropped him dead. Odin, wisest of them all, would be swallowed whole by the great wolf Fenrir. The giants would win, the world would burn, the seas would rise, and everything would end. And some scholars believe this ending was not pure imagination, because the Norse carried a memory older than they knew the memory of a real catastrophe, when around the year 536, a haze of volcanic ash blotted out the sun across the northern world, crops failed, and an unnatural winter stretched on and on. A winter that would not end. Perhaps the giants were always real, just written into the sky as ash instead of flesh. So let me finally answer the question I asked you at the very beginning. How could such small people ever believe they had defeated the giants? The truth is, they didn't. They never claimed to. The giants were never meant to be beaten, because you cannot beat the winter, or the mountain, or old age, or the ending of all things. To the Norse, victory was never about winning forever. It was about standing your ground when you already knew how the story ended, resisting the chaos for one more season, one more night, one more breath. That was the courage they worshipped, and that is who dared to face the giants, people who fought precisely because they knew they would lose. And if you look closely, the giants never actually left. They only changed shape, the storm, the illness, the grief, the fear pressing quietly against your own door tonight. So the real question was never about the Vikings. It's about you. When your giant comes, Will you have the courage to stand? If stories like this one stir something in you, stay with us here at Shadows of Valhalla, because the sagas of the North were never only about the dead. They were always about how to live.